Welcome, and thank you for being here tonight. Settle in, find your stillness, and let the concerns of the day drift away like clouds moving past a mountain that has stood for longer than memory can reach. Tonight we are going to travel somewhere very old and very far, to a realm of golden towers and eternal skies, to the story of a god who had to learn what it meant to be worthy of the power he carried, and to the civilization that shaped him across centuries beyond counting. This is the story of Thor Odinson and the realm of Asgard, a tale that stretches from the first moments of creation through ages of war and wisdom and loss and renewal, a story about fathers and sons, about brothers who love each other and wound each other in equal measure, about what it truly means to hold great power gently. There is no rush here. Let the thunder come slowly, and let it carry you somewhere peaceful and ancient and full of wonder. Before there was a hammer, before there was a hero, before there was even a name for the storm that lived in him, there was a tree. Not a tree in the way that a forest contains trees, not something rooted in ordinary soil and reaching toward a sky that any creature might recognize and name. This tree was something else entirely, something that existed before the concept of sky had been separated from the concept of ground. Something whose roots and branches extended not through space but through the fabric of what is, connecting realms that are less like countries on a map and more like different qualities of existence, different ways that reality can arrange itself, each one as real as the others but none of them touching in any ordinary way. The old Norse peoples who first told these stories called it Yggdrasil, the World Tree, and in the Marvel Comics tradition that has built upon and transformed that mythology, across more than 6 decades of storytelling, Yggdrasil remains at the centre of everything, the great invisible architecture that makes the 9 realms possible and holds them in their proper relationship to one another. To understand Thor Odinson, it helps to first understand the world he comes from, because Asgard is not simply a place where he happened to be born, the way a person might be born in one city or another, without the city becoming essential to what they are. Asgard made Thor, shaped him, filled him with its particular set of values and its particular understanding of what a life well lived looks like, and then sent him out into other realms to discover where those values needed refining and where they needed to be broken apart and rebuilt from the ground up. The civilization of Asgard is the context without which none of his story makes sense, and so we begin there, in the golden light before the thunder, before the exile and the worthiness, and all of the beautiful, terrible lessons that were still waiting to be learned. Asgard, as the Marvel Comics tradition imagines it across the foundational work of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, beginning in 1962, and the many gifted creators who have continued and deepened that tradition since, exists at the top of the World Tree, occupying a realm of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary scale. The city itself, when seen from a distance, resembles something a dreaming architect might have designed if given unlimited materials and unlimited time. All soaring towers of gold and pale stone catching light that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Bridges arching over distances that would be called chasms anywhere else, but that here seem simply generous, appropriate to beings whose strides are longer and whose lifespans run to centuries. The sky above Asgard is perpetually dramatic, filled with clouds that move with purpose, backlit by a sun that does not quite behave the way Earth's sun behaves, and crossed at intervals by the Bifrost, the rainbow bridge that connects Asgard to the other realms, shimmering with colours that have no names in any human language. What is perhaps most important to understand about Asgard as a place is that it is not paradise in the way that word is sometimes used to describe, somewhere without pain or difficulty. The Asgardians have always known that their world would eventually end, that Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, was written into the fabric of their existence, the way night is written into the structure of a day. They have known this for as long as they have existed, have had seers and prophecies and the testimony of the Norns, those ancient beings who weave the threads of fate at the base of Yggdrasil, to confirm it repeatedly. And yet they have continued to build, to love, to pursue excellence in battle and in craft and in wisdom, to raise children and honour ancestors and tell stories about heroes who faced impossible odds and found, in the facing of them, something worth celebrating. This is the particular quality of Asgardian civilization that gives it its emotional texture, the awareness of ending held alongside the insistence on meaning, the knowledge that nothing lasts forever, balanced against the conviction that this only makes the things that exist more precious rather than less. The 9 realms connected by Yggdrasil each represent something distinct, each occupying a different position in the great cosmological arrangement that governs how this version of the universe works. Asgard sits at the crown, home to the gods and warriors of the Norse tradition, as Marvel has reimagined them. Midgard, which the Asgardians understand to be the human world, occupies a middle position, a realm of shorter lives and smaller scale but no less significance. And the relationship between Asgard and Midgard is one of the oldest and most important threads running through the entire Thor mythology. Jotunheim is the realm of the frost giants, beings of tremendous size and cold power, whose relationship with Asgard has alternated between open war and uneasy truce across ages of history, and whose significance to Thor's story is more personal and more painful than he understands for a very long time. Niflheim and Hel exist as realms of death and shadow, governed by Hela, whose presence moves through the Thor mythology like a cold wind that no architecture can quite keep out. Svartalfheim is home to the Dark Elves, Vanaheim to the elder gods known as the Vanir, Alfheim to the Light Elves, and Nidavellir to the Dwarves, whose skills as craftsmen produced Mjolnir itself, the hammer at the centre of everything. Each of these realms has its own internal life, its own politics and history and set of concerns, and Thor's story touches each of them in different ways across its long unfolding. But it is Asgard that is home, Asgard that shaped him, and Asgard whose values and contradictions he carries within himself throughout all of his adventures in other realms and other worlds. To understand him is to understand something about what Asgard teaches and what it does not teach, about the particular mixture of greatness and blindness that a civilization built on honour and martial excellence tends to produce in its most celebrated children. Odin All-father, the ruler of Asgard and the figure who presides over everything in Thor's early story the way a weather system presides over a landscape, is one of the most complex figures in all of Marvel Comics mythology, and it is worth pausing with him here at the beginning before his son enters the picture. Because the world that Odin created and the expectations he carried into fatherhood are the soil in which everything that follows grows. Odin is ancient in a way that is difficult to fully comprehend, a being who has existed through multiple cycles of cosmic history, who sacrificed one of his eyes to drink from the well of Mimir and gain wisdom, who has made decisions that reshaped the fates of entire civilizations, and has carried the weight of those decisions through the centuries without setting it down. He rules Asgard not simply because he is the most powerful being within it, though he is, but because he has earned his authority through long experience and genuine wisdom, through mistakes acknowledged and lessons absorbed in the slow, difficult work of becoming someone fit to lead. His weakness, if it can be called that, is the particular kind of love that manifests as control, the love of a being who cares so deeply about an outcome that he cannot always trust the process of arriving there naturally. This will matter enormously when we come to speak of his sons. For now it is enough to say that Odin's Asgard is a magnificent place built on genuine values and genuine wisdom, and that it is also a place where the pressure of expectation and the weight of destiny can press down on a young prince, with a force that even Mjolnir cannot quite lift. The court of Asgard, as the Kirby and Lee comics imagined it, and as later creators have populated and elaborated, is filled with warriors and scholars, with seers who speak in riddles and craftsmen whose work outlasts the ages. There are feasting halls that can hold thousands, and libraries whose shelves hold the accumulated knowledge of civilizations that rose and fell before Midgard's recorded history began. There are healing rooms tended by those with gifts for restoration, and training grounds where the arts of war are studied with the same seriousness that other civilizations bring to philosophy or mathematics. Asgard takes seriously the idea that excellence is cultivated rather than simply given, that even those born with exceptional gifts must work to understand and master what they carry, and this belief is embedded in everything about how young Asgardians are raised and educated. The Asgardians themselves are not gods in the way that the word is sometimes used to mean beings of infinite power and infinite knowledge. They are mortal in the sense that they can die, though it takes far more than an ordinary wound to kill them, and they age, though across timescales that make human lifespans seem like brief bright flares of light in a long darkness. They feel love and grief and pride and shame. They make mistakes that they must then live with across centuries. They carry grudges and tend friendships and experience the particular anguish of watching someone they love choose a path that leads away from happiness. They are, in other words, comprehensible, which is perhaps the most important thing about them, the quality that allows the stories told about them to carry genuine emotional weight, rather than simply spectacle. The Bifrost, that shimmering bridge of light and colour that connects Asgard to the other realms, is tended by Heimdall, whose senses are so acute that he can hear the grass growing on Midgard and see across the distances between worlds as clearly as a man standing at a window sees the street below. Heimdall's role is both practical and symbolic. He is the guardian of thresholds, the being who decides what passes between realms and what does not, and his presence at the edge of Asgard serves as a reminder that this is a civilization with borders, with a sense of what belongs within and what must be kept without. His gold armour and his watchful stillness have become one of the enduring images of the Thor comics, a figure of absolute reliability in a mythology where so much else is subject to change and surprise. It is into this world, golden and dramatic and ancient and alive with the particular weight of a civilization that has always known its own ending and chosen to be extraordinary anyway, that two boys were born and raised as brothers, shaped by the same father and the same realm and the same expectations, and yet made so differently by what they did with all of that shaping that their lives would eventually become the most important story Asgard had to tell. But that is the next part of the story, and it will come in its own time, at its own unhurried pace, the way all the best Asgardian stories do, with the understanding that what has been waiting for centuries can afford to arrive gently. For now, let the image of the world tree settle into your mind, its roots extending downward into realms of shadow and its branches reaching upward into light, each realm hanging in its proper place like a lantern on an ancient branch, the whole vast structure vibrating very slightly with something that is not quite sound but that the body recognizes anyway, the deep hum of everything that exists being held in its proper relationship to everything else. Let Asgard's golden light find you wherever you are resting tonight, warm and steady and patient. The light of a civilization that has always known how to wait for what matters. The golden light of Asgard, then, was the first light that Thor Odinson ever knew, and it is worth staying with that image for a moment before the story begins to move, because the quality of that early light, warm and expansive and full of a particular kind of confidence that comes from existing at the top of the world tree, shaped everything about the boy who grew up inside it. He was, by every account that the old stories preserve, and that the Marvel Comics tradition has elaborated across decades of telling and retelling, an extraordinary child from the very beginning. Not extraordinary in the way that causes discomfort in those who witness it, not the cold, remote excellence of someone born so far above ordinary experience that they cannot be approached or understood, but extraordinary in the way of someone whose gifts are worn lightly, whose strength and speed and instinctive courage seem simply to be expressions of a nature that is fundamentally joyful, fundamentally alive to the world in which it finds itself. Thor as a young prince of Asgard was not yet wise, and he would be the last to claim otherwise in his older years, but he was genuinely, deeply good in the way that the very young sometimes are before experience begins to complicate goodness with understanding, before the knowledge of what the world actually contains begins to qualify the warmth with which a generous heart meets it. He was large even by Asgardian standards, broad-shouldered and physically powerful in ways that became apparent earlier than they did in most of his peers, and he moved through the training grounds and feasting halls of Asgard with the particular ease of someone who has never had serious reason to doubt that the space they occupy is rightfully theirs. His hair was the colour of wheat in late summer, his eyes the particular blue that the sky above Asgard takes on in the hours just before a storm, and his laughter was, by all accounts, one of the most recognisable sounds in the royal quarter of the Golden City, loud and unguarded and completely without self-consciousness, the laughter of someone who finds genuine delight in the world and sees no reason to modulate that delight for the comfort of those who might prefer something quieter. What made Thor remarkable, even before Mjolnir entered his life and before the exile, and before all of the long education in humility that his story eventually required of him, was the sincerity with which he inhabited every moment. He trained with complete commitment, fought with complete ferocity, loved with complete openness, and experienced even the minor frustrations of a young warrior's education, the lesson that needed repeating, the skill that resisted mastery, the opponent who consistently found ways through his guard, with a wholehearted frustration that was somehow more endearing than annoying, because it was so clearly the frustration of someone who cared genuinely, rather than someone merely wounded in their pride. He was, in the language that would have made no sense in Asgard, but that the readers of his comic book stories have always instinctively understood. The kind of person you would want beside you when things went badly, not because he would always know what to do, but because his commitment to standing there with you would never waver. Across the training grounds and council chambers and long, feasting tables of Asgard, he was adored. The Warriors Three, who would become his closest companions and whose own stories are woven so completely through his that they cannot properly be told apart, gathered around him naturally, drawn by something that was not quite charisma in the calculated sense, and not quite power in the simple physical sense, but some combination of genuine warmth and genuine courage that made his company feel like standing near a fire on a cold night. Even the more reserved figures of the Asgardian court, the scholars and the seers and those whose temperaments ran to quieter excellences, found themselves speaking more freely in his presence than they might have expected, because Thor's attention, when he gave it, was complete and without judgment, and that quality is rarer and more valuable than physical strength in almost any civilization one can name. And then there was Loki. To speak of Thor without speaking of Loki is impossible, not merely because their stories are so thoroughly entangled that separating them would leave both incomplete, but because in a deeper sense Thor can only be fully understood in contrast to and in relationship with the brother who was in almost every way his opposite, and who loved him, and envied him, and sought to destroy him, and saved him, and returned, again and again across centuries of conflict and reconciliation, to something that might be called love again if love is understood to be a thing that survives the full range of what people do to each other when they care too much. Their relationship is, in the end, the emotional centre of the Thor mythology, in a way that even Thor's relationship with Odin or his love for Midgard cannot quite match, because it is the relationship that most completely refuses simplification, that most stubbornly insists on being understood in its full complexity before it yields any of its meaning. Loki came to Asgard not as a son born to Odin and Frigga, but as the child of a different kind of story entirely. His father was Loki, king of the frost giants of Jotunheim, and his birth was attended by circumstances that the Marvel Comics tradition has depicted with considerable care and emotional nuance. Loki was small at birth, small by the standards of frost giants, whose children are expected to be as large and cold and formidable as the realm that produces them, and Loki, for whom power and the appearance of power were not distinguishable, abandoned him as something unworthy of the name he would have carried. Odin found the child during one of the great conflicts between Asgard and Jotunheim, found him hidden away in a temple, as though even abandoned he had been protected by some force that the story does not entirely explain, and made a choice that would ripple forward through centuries and reshape the fates of everyone connected to him. He brought the child home. He raised him as a son. He gave him the name Loki and the privileges of a prince, and, within the limits of his particular and somewhat complicated way of expressing it, the genuine warmth of a father's love. What Odin perhaps did not fully reckon with, or perhaps reckoned with, and chose to hope would not matter, was how thoroughly Loki would know. Not immediately, not as a young child playing beside Thor in the corridors of the Golden City, perhaps not even as a young man in training alongside his brother in the yards where Asgardian warriors developed their skills. But somewhere in the space between childhood and maturity, in the years when identity begins to become something a person actively constructs rather than simply inhabits, Loki began to feel a difference that he could not name but could not ignore. He sensed that the space he occupied in Asgard had been arranged around him rather than grown to fit him, that the warmth of the court was genuine, but that it extended to him on conditions that were never quite made explicit, and that he could never quite be certain he was meeting. This is not to say that the young Loki was unhappy in any simple sense. The comics tradition that has given us the fullest portraits of his early life, most notably the work done in the Mythology foundational texts, and the later explorations of his character in more psychologically sophisticated runs, consistently shows a boy of extraordinary intelligence and genuine charm, someone who took to the magical arts of Asgard with the same natural ease that Thor took to its martial ones, whose mind moved faster than almost anyone around him, and whose ability to see the hidden connections between things made him a fascinating companion for anyone interested in complexity. He was quick and bright and capable of great warmth when warmth felt safe, and the friendship between the two brothers in their early years was real, built on the genuine complementarity of their natures, Thor's physical directness meeting Loki's intellectual subtlety in ways that made each of them more capable than either would have been alone. Loki was the brother who could talk them out of trouble after Thor had charged directly into it. Thor was the brother who could act when Loki had been paralysed by the number of possible actions available to him and the complexity of their likely consequences. In battle, which occupied a significant portion of young Asgardian life even in peacetime, they were formidable together in ways that neither quite matched alone, and there are accounts in the older parts of the Thor mythology of adventures shared in their youth that carry the particular quality of stories told by people who look back on a time when things were simpler and feel the distance between that time and the present as something that sits in the chest rather than simply in the mind. The difficulty was not with any single event, but with the accumulation of 1,000 small moments in which Loki found himself measuring the distance between himself and his brother and finding that distance larger than he wished it were. Odin's pride in Thor was genuine and enormous and not particularly private, the pride of a father who sees in his son the continuation of everything he has built and everything he values, and while Odin's pride in Loki was also genuine, it was a more complicated thing, complicated by worry as well as love, by the awareness that Loki's gifts were the kind that a civilization built on martial excellence did not quite know how to honour in the straightforward way it honoured Thor's. The court celebrated what it recognised, and what it recognised most immediately was strength and boldness, and the particular kind of courage that expresses itself through action rather than through thought. And Loki, whose courage was real, but whose expression of it was almost always indirect, almost always achieved through cunning rather than confrontation, found himself in a hall full of people who respected him without quite understanding him, which is one of the lonelier experiences available to an intelligent person in almost any context. It was during this period of their youth that Mjolnir came into their lives, or rather came into Thor's life in the particular way that it would reshape everything that followed. The hammer had been forged in Nidavellir by the dwarven craftsman, whose skills with metal and enchantment were unmatched across all 9 realms, forged from Uru metal at Odin's commission, and imbued with an enchantment that Odin himself placed upon it, an enchantment that transformed a weapon of extraordinary physical power into something that was also a test, a moral instrument, a means by which the question of readiness for great power could be continuously asked and answered. The words of the enchantment, as they have been rendered in the comics tradition, speak of worthiness as the condition for the hammer's use, establishing that Mjolnir is not simply a very powerful object available to the strongest available hand, but a thing that will yield itself only to someone who has earned the right to carry it in a sense that goes beyond mere physical capability. For the young Thor, who was already the most physically gifted warrior of his generation, the arrival of Mjolnir was experienced primarily as a confirmation. Of course he could lift it. Of course its power felt natural in his hands, an extension of who he already was and what he already represented. The enchantment felt less like a standard he needed to meet, and more like a recognition of what he had already become, and this interpretation, while not entirely wrong, was also not entirely right. And the distance between what he thought Mjolnir's gift meant and what it actually required of him would be the central subject of his education for years to come. For Loki, watching his brother receive this confirmation of primacy from the instrument that their father had commissioned and enchanted, the moment had a different quality entirely. Loki did not attempt to lift Mjolnir, not then, not in that early period, because his intelligence always moved a step ahead of his pride, and he understood that a public failure of that particular kind was not something he could easily recover from. But the existence of the hammer and what it represented, this concrete enchanted declaration, that Thor was the heir and the worthy one and the son in whom all the hopes of Asgard were properly invested, settled into him as one more piece of evidence for a case that was still being assembled slowly and painfully in the part of his mind that kept track of all the ways in which the space he occupied had always been slightly smaller than the space occupied by the brother who stood beside him. And yet they remained brothers. They remained, for all of the gathering distance and the slow accumulation of grievance, genuinely important to each other in ways that the later conflict between them would test but never entirely erase. There is something in the Thor mythology, in the version that the Marvel comics have built and sustained across more than 6 decades, that insists on the reality of this early bond, even as it insists equally on the reality of how completely that bond would be strained because the story only works, can only carry the emotional weight it needs to carry if what eventually breaks between them was real enough to be worth breaking. Love and rivalry and betrayal, and the long unfinished work of understanding each other, this is what the two sons of Odin carried with them out of their golden childhood and into the world that was waiting to teach them both, in very different ways, what they were actually made of. The boy who had lifted Mjolnir with such easy confidence, who had worn his worthiness like a garment that had always fit perfectly, would need to lose everything before he could understand what he actually possessed. This is the nature of certain kinds of education. They cannot be delivered in a classroom or absorbed through observation of someone else's experience. They require the full weight of consequence, the complete removal of what has been taken for granted, the particular silence that settles in when the things that defined you are no longer present, and you must discover, in that silence, whether there is anything underneath them that belongs to you alone. Odin, for all of his complexity as a father, and all of the complications his love would create across centuries of his son's life, understood this. He had lived long enough, and lost enough, and rebuilt himself from loss, enough times to know that the lesson Thor most needed could not be given. It could only be arranged, and then endured, and then slowly, painfully understood. The specific event that precipitated Thor's exile, as the Marvel Comics tradition established it across the foundational work of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, and deepened through subsequent retellings, was an act of impulsive arrogance that endangered the fragile peace between Asgard and Jotunheim, and very nearly reignited a war between realms whose previous conflicts had cost thousands of lives. A group of frost giants had infiltrated Asgard's weapons vault, drawn by the presence of the Casket of Ancient Winters, one of the most powerful artifacts in the Nine Realms, and Thor's response to the discovery of this infiltration was not the measured diplomatic response that the situation required, and that a prince preparing to eventually rule a civilization ought to have been capable of providing. It was instead the response of someone who had never seriously questioned whether his first instinct was also his best instinct. Someone for whom action had always been immediately available as an alternative to thought, and who had never yet paid a price serious enough to teach him the difference. He gathered the warriors Three and Sif, and went to Jotunheim. He went without his father's permission, without diplomatic preparation, without any plan beyond the immediate satisfaction of meeting a provocation with overwhelming force and demonstrating, in the clearest possible terms, that Asgard was not a realm that absorbed insults quietly. The battle that followed was fierce and genuine, and showcased every quality that had always made Thor exceptional as a warrior. The speed and strength and absolute fearlessness, the instinctive coordination with companions he had trained alongside for decades, the particular kind of courage that does not slow down to calculate the odds, because the calculation has never once come back with a number that gave it pause. By the standards of what it was, a display of martial supremacy, it was a complete success. By the standards of what it needed to be, an act of princely wisdom in service of the realm's long-term safety and stability, it was a catastrophe. Odin's arrival in Jotunheim, his intervention to stop a battle that was moments away from becoming the opening engagement of a new and devastating war, carried the particular quality of a judgment delivered by someone who had seen this coming, and had hoped, against his better knowledge, that he was wrong. The anger between them on the Bifrost afterward was not the simple anger of a father disappointed in a son's misbehaviour. It was something older and heavier than that, the anger of a being who understood exactly what had almost been lost, and who recognised in his son's defiance not malice but something in some ways more difficult to address, the absolute sincerity of someone who could not yet see past his own certainty to the complexity of the world beyond it. "You are not ready," Odin told him, and the words landed with a weight that Thor in that moment entirely rejected. What followed was the exile, not banishment in the punitive sense, not a casting out designed simply to punish, but something Odin understood as a gift, though he knew it would not be received as one. Thor was stripped of his memories of who he was, stripped of his power and his connection to Mjolnir, stripped of everything that had defined him since before he could form a clear recollection, and sent to Midgard as a mortal man, vulnerable in ways he had never been vulnerable, dependent in ways he had never been dependent, and completely without the context that had always told him what to do and who he was in any given moment. Mjolnir was sent after him, embedded in the stone of a New Mexico desert with its own version of the enchantment clearly articulated for anyone who might find it. The declaration that whosoever holds this hammer, if they be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor, and the hammer settled into the earth and waited as Odin waited as the story waited for the education to begin. The man who woke in that New Mexico landscape found by a young astrophysicist and her colleagues, whose particular area of study had led them to exactly the right location at exactly the right moment, had no name that came easily to mind, and no history that he could access, and no understanding of why the world felt so different from the world his body remembered without being able to describe. His name in this mortal form was Donald Blake, a name Odin had prepared for him the way a parent might prepare a room for a child they know is coming, and the identity that came with that name was modest and quiet, and defined primarily by service, a medical doctor whose practice focused on those who needed care, and whose professional life was built around the particular kind of attention that requires setting oneself aside in order to genuinely perceive another person's suffering. It was, in its way, the most precise possible counter to everything that Thor's previous existence had celebrated and rewarded, and whether Odin chose it deliberately for that reason, or whether the shape of the exile simply demanded it, the result was the same. Donald Blake's life on Midgard had a texture that was entirely unfamiliar to the being living it from the inside, though of course the being living it had no access to that unfamiliarity, because the memories that would have provided the contrast were gone. He moved through human spaces at human speeds, waited in lines and experienced weather as an inconvenience rather than an element he commanded, ate meals at regular intervals because his body required it, felt the accumulated tiredness of a long day in ways that settled into his muscles and his eyes, and the particular heaviness behind the temples that mortals know as the ordinary cost of sustained effort. He made mistakes and corrected them, encountered problems that required patience rather than force, learned to listen in the particular way that medicine demands, attending not just to what a patient said but to everything they were not saying. To the story the body told when the voice was too frightened or too accustomed to its own suffering to tell it directly. There was a quality to this life that the young prince of Asgard would have found incomprehensible, and that the man living it found, in the way that people find the lives they are actually living, simply real. The satisfactions were smaller than anything Thor had known, and also more consistently available. The gratitude of a patient who had been afraid, and was no longer afraid, the particular pleasure of a problem understood and addressed, the company of colleagues whose respect was earned through demonstrated competence, rather than granted through birthright. Donald Blake was not a remarkable man by the standards that Asgard applied to remarkability, but he was a genuinely good one by standards that Asgard had not always remembered to apply, and the slow accumulation of that goodness, practiced daily in the absence of any memory of an alternative, was doing exactly the work that Odin had intended it to do, laying down in the character of his son a set of experiences and instincts and deeply felt understandings that the prince had never had occasion to develop in the golden city at the top of the world tree. The period of the exile extended across what felt to the man living it like an ordinary medical career in its earlier stages, full of the particular density of experience that comes with learning a difficult profession while also navigating the ordinary complexities of adult human life. He had patients who recovered and patients who did not, decisions made in uncertainty that turned out to be right, and decisions made in equal uncertainty that turned out to be wrong, and in each case he stayed. He remained present with the outcome rather than withdrawing from it. He allowed the full weight of both success and failure to settle into him, and became, gradually, someone who understood in his body what it meant to be responsible for another person's well-being in the most literal possible sense. What he did not have, and what his body seemed to be missing in ways he could not quite articulate even to himself, was any sense of completion. There was something at the edge of Donald Blake's experience that felt like a word he'd forgotten, a capability that his hands remembered performing, but that his mind could not retrieve, a sense of scale that did not fit the life he was living no matter how fully and genuinely he inhabited it. He was not unhappy. This is important to understand. The exile was not a torment in the sense of sustained misery, because Odin loved his son too completely to design it as punishment alone. But there was a quality of incompleteness to it, a sense that the story was waiting for something, that the man moving through these modest and meaningful days was in some deep sense in transit, somewhere between who he had been and who he was becoming, and that the destination was not yet visible. It came to him in Norway, during a hiking trip that the story records with the spare detail of an event that was always going to happen exactly this way, regardless of any choice made in its approach. He was exploring coastal terrain when the weather turned suddenly serious, the way Norwegian coastal weather will, and he took shelter in a cave whose walls turned out to contain something that the tourist maps had not recorded. Deep within the cave, lodged in stone with a certainty that suggested it had been there since before the cave itself had a name, was a wooden walking stick, ordinary in every visible respect, unremarkable in the way that objects sometimes appear to be when they are waiting for the right person to touch them. He touched it. He struck it against the stone floor of the cave and the walking stick and the man holding it, and the entire Norwegian coastline vanished behind something that was not quite light and not quite sound, but that the body experienced as both simultaneously. And Donald Blake was no longer present, and Thor Odinson stood where he had been, whole and enormous and blazing with the particular energy of a being restored to itself after a long absence. Mjolnir in his hand and all the memories of Asgard rushing back through him like water through a channel that had been dry for too long. The return of his memories was not simply a restoration. It was an experience of contrast, the simultaneous presence of two complete sets of knowledge about what it meant to exist. One set gathered across centuries in the golden realm of his birth, and the other assembled quietly across the years of a mortal life in a small Norwegian practice and the hospital corridors of a world that had gone on entirely without him and had needed nothing from him except his attention and his competence and his willingness to remain. He was Thor. He had always been Thor. And he was also, now, someone who knew what it felt like to be Donald Blake. And that knowledge sat inside the restored power like something that would never entirely dissolve, a flavouring in everything that followed, a set of instincts and experiences that the young prince who had ridden into Jotunheim in a blaze of unexamined certainty had not possessed and could not have acquired any other way. He was not yet the king he would eventually become. He was not yet the deeply humble, deeply wise figure that all of the later education would slowly produce. He had been given the beginning of something, a crack in the certainty, a lived understanding of smallness and service, and the particular dignity of a life whose greatness is measured in individual moments of genuine help rather than in battles won and enemies defeated. And that beginning was enough for now to make the enchantment on Mjolnir hold. He was worthy, differently worthy than he had been before the exile, worthy in a way that had some substance underneath it now, some experience of what it actually costs to set aside the claims of the self in service of something beyond it. Odin, wherever he watched from, would have recognized the change immediately, would have felt the particular satisfaction of someone whose most difficult decision had produced exactly the outcome that justified its difficulty. The hammer that had waited in the stone, patient as the world tree itself, had been claimed again, and the god of thunder was returning to the world that needed him, carrying inside him the quiet, indelible knowledge of what it had meant to be a man who fixed what was broken and stayed with what was painful, and asked nothing in return but the chance to continue doing the same thing tomorrow. The man who returned from the cave in Norway was not the same man who had entered it, and yet the world he returned to was, in most respects, unchanged. Midgard continued at its own pace, indifferent to the restoration that had just taken place on a windswept coastal hillside, and the people who occupied that world, the colleagues and patients and neighbours who had known Donald Blake as a quiet, competent, genuinely kind physician, continued to need the same things they had always needed, continued to move through their days with the same mixture of hope and difficulty, and ordinary courage that Thor had spent years learning to recognise and honour. This was the first and perhaps most important lesson of the returned god's new life on Earth, that the world did not reorganise itself around his restoration, that the human scale of things he had learned to inhabit and genuinely love during his exile did not simply dissolve now that the full weight of his Asgardian identity had been given back to him. Both were real, both made claims on him, and the question of how to honour both simultaneously would occupy him for a very long time. Jane Foster was already part of Donald Blake's life when the cave in Norway changed everything, and the particular quality of her presence in it, warm and intelligent and possessed of a directness that had always felt to Donald Blake like a form of respect, made her one of the first things Thor's restored mind moved toward as it began to understand what returning to itself actually meant. She was a nurse in his medical practice, later an astrophysicist in tellings that updated her professional life to reflect the decades of her character's evolution, and from the first she'd been someone whose attention to the world around her matched his own in ways that created a natural and uncomplicated ease between them. She noticed things. She asked questions that went past the surface of what was immediately visible and reached for the structure underneath. She was, in the vocabulary that the Asgardian part of Thor's mind had always used to organize its understanding of people, genuinely brave, not in the martial sense that Asgard most readily celebrated, but in the quieter and in some ways more demanding sense of someone who does not look away from difficult truths simply because looking at them is uncomfortable. Thor's love for Jane Foster, as it developed across the early years of his return, and as the Marvel comics explored and deepened it beginning with those first foundational issues of Journey into Mystery in 1962, was not the love of a god condescending to find something worthy of his attention in a lesser being. This is worth being clear about, because it would have been an easy and a lesser story to tell, the divine figure charmed by mortal novelty, the human woman dazzled by proximity to power, both of them performing a connection that neither had actually made. What the Thor mythology at its best has always insisted upon instead is something more genuinely interesting and more emotionally true, the love of a being who had just spent years learning, at the most intimate possible level, what it meant to be human. For a woman who embodied many of the qualities that experience had taught him to recognize as remarkable. He did not love her despite her mortality. He loved her in full knowledge of it, and the full knowledge made the love more urgent and more serious rather than less, because the years of Donald Blake had given him a felt understanding of what it meant for a life to be finite, and finite things he had learned were not less precious for their brevity but more so. Jane, for her part, responded to Donald Blake and then to Thor with the particular combination of openness and caution that characterizes someone of genuine intelligence, encountering something that challenges their existing understanding of how the world works. She was a scientist in her bones, committed to evidence and to the discipline of not believing what she wished were true simply because she wished it. And the evidence that accumulated around Donald Blake as his true nature began to make itself apparent through the fabric of his mortal cover was evidence she approached with the same careful attention she brought to everything. She asked questions, she observed. She did not perform ignorance she did not feel or surprise she had already moved past, and when the reality of what she had been working beside became undeniable, she received it with a steadiness that Thor found more moving than he had expected, because he had not yet fully understood that human steadiness, the particular human capacity for continuing to function and to care in the presence of things that exceed ordinary comprehension, was one of the qualities he most admired about the world his exile had taught him to love. Their relationship deepened through proximity and through the particular kind of trust that develops between people who have seen each other manage difficulty with grace. Thor's early heroic activities on Midgard, which began almost immediately after his restoration, and which drew on the natural intersection between his Asgardian capabilities and the very real need for someone with those capabilities in a world that was beginning, in the Marvel Comics tradition of the early 1960s, to discover that ordinary law enforcement was not equipped to handle every category of threat it was now facing, brought him into situations of real danger with regularity, and Jane's response to those situations was never the helpless worry of someone waiting on the margins of another person's story. She was present, she was useful, and she was honest, including honest about her fear, which Thor found more valuable than false courage, because it was the honesty rather than the fearlessness that required genuine bravery to maintain. He told her, in the gradual way that trust permits rather than all at once in a single revelation, more of the truth about himself than he had imagined he would tell anyone on Midgard. Not everything, not immediately, because the layers of identity he was navigating, Thor the Asgardian prince, Donald Blake the mortal physician, the hero who was beginning to be known by the name Spider-Man's contemporaries in the emerging New York hero community were learning to use, made complete transparency complicated in ways that had nothing to do with willingness. But enough. He told her enough that she could see the shape of what she was loving, the full, strange, enormous shape of it, the centuries of history and the realm of gold and the hammer and the father and the exile and the return, and she did not retreat from the shape. She held it in her attention with the same steady scientist patience with which she held every other complex and demanding truth, and she stayed. The complications that entered their relationship from outside were not slow in arriving. Odin, whose view from Asgard encompassed things that neither Thor nor Jane could see from where they stood, had reservations about the relationship that were not rooted in any failure of Jane's character or any absence of her worth as a human being. They were rooted in something older and more structural than personal judgment, in the awareness that a god and a mortal who loved each other were loving across a distance that time would eventually make unbridgeable, that the same finiteness which made Jane's life precious and her love urgent would ultimately take her from Thor in a way that no amount of genuine feeling could prevent, and that the grief of that loss, arriving inevitably, would cost his son something that centuries of subsequent life would not fully restore. Odin had lived long enough to know what it looked like when an immortal being loved a mortal one completely, and he had lived long enough to have seen that story reach its ending more than once, and the endings had always left the same mark. His interventions in the relationship took various forms across the early comics, ranging from direct commands to more indirect pressures, and Thor's response to them was one of the first sustained tests of how thoroughly the exile had actually changed him. The young prince who had ridden into Jotunheim on the strength of his own unexamined certainty would have responded to his father's interference with the same wholehearted defiance he had brought to every other obstacle, would have planted himself in front of the relationship the way he planted himself in front of enemies, and simply refused to move. The returned Thor, the one who carried Donald Blake's years inside him like a second heartbeat, was more complicated than that. He understood, in a way the younger version of himself had not been capable of understanding, that Odin's concern was real, that the love behind the interference was genuine even when the interference itself was wrong, that disagreeing with his father about this did not require him to refuse to understand his father's reasoning. He disagreed anyway. He stayed. He continued to love Jane with the full weight of an Asgardian prince's capacity for feeling, which was, it turned out, considerable, and he did so while holding his father's concern inside his understanding of the situation rather than simply discarding it, which was harder than defiance and also more honest. The tension this created was not comfortable for anyone involved, and it would not resolve quickly or cleanly. Because the things Odin was worried about were not false concerns that could be dismissed with the arrival of better information. They were accurate assessments of real structural difficulties, and the question of what to do with accurate assessments of real structural difficulties when love is pulling in a different direction is not a question that has a simple answer in any realm, mortal or divine. Jane's awareness of this tension, her understanding that the relationship she was in was complicated not just by the ordinary difficulties of two people learning to share their lives, but by the specific and weighty complications of loving someone whose father was a god-king with strong opinions and significant reach, shaped her experience of the early years of their love in ways that made them more serious and more quietly arduous than love is sometimes imagined to be. She was not passive in this. She did not simply absorb the complications and wait for them to resolve. She brought her own perspective to bear, her scientist habit of looking at a situation clearly rather than through the lens of what she wished it were, and what she saw, clearly and without self-deception, was that she loved a being whose life would continue long after hers had ended, and that this fact did not change what she felt, but it did change what she could reasonably expect, and the maturity required to hold both of those truths at once, without letting either one cancel the other, was perhaps the most difficult thing the relationship asked of her. Thor's heroic activities on Midgard during this period, the early years of his time as one of Earth's defenders, had a quality that distinguished them from the work of his human counterparts in ways that went beyond the obvious differences in physical capability. He brought to every confrontation the particular emotional register of someone operating in a world he genuinely loved but did not entirely belong to, whose investment in the protection of Midgard was not the investment of someone defending their home ground, but the investment of someone defending a place they had chosen, which is a different thing, and in some ways a more deliberate thing, requiring a continuous renewal of commitment that belonging does not. Every person he helped was someone he saw with the particular clarity of a being who had been one of them, had moved through the world at their scale and their speed, and felt the weight of their ordinary days, and who had returned from that experience with an appreciation for what they were and what they faced that no amount of external observation from Asgard could have provided. The community of heroes that was beginning to form around him during this period, the early Avengers whose founding Loki had inadvertently precipitated, and whose significance to the future of Midgard's defence would prove enormous, offered Thor a different kind of belonging than either Asgard or his relationship with Jane could provide. These were people, broadly understood, who operated at a scale somewhat closer to his own, who faced categories of threat that required capabilities beyond the ordinary, and who were, each in their own way, navigating the same essential question of what it meant to use extraordinary power in service of a world that had not asked for your protection and would not always welcome it. The friendships he began to form there, most notably with Steve Rogers, whose particular quality of moral seriousness Thor recognized immediately as something akin to what the exile had been teaching him, would deepen over years and decades into something he would eventually understand as among the most important relationships of his long life. But the emotional centre of his time on Midgard in those early years remained Jane, and the love between them remained the most immediate and the most personally significant expression of everything his exile had given him, the proof that the education had taken root, that the being who had returned from the cave in Norway with Mjolnir in his hand was genuinely different from the one who had entered it, genuinely capable now of the kind of love that does not ask the beloved to be something other than what they are, that finds in the particular shape of another person's limitations not an inconvenience to be managed, but a part of what makes them irreplaceable and worth staying for, in full knowledge of every difficulty that staying will eventually require. While Thor was learning in the mortal world what it meant to love something he could not protect from time, his brother was learning something else entirely, something that would take much longer to resolve and whose resolution, when it finally came across decades of storytelling and multiple cycles of conflict and painful partial reconciliation, would never quite achieve the cleanness that healing is sometimes imagined to possess. Loki's education was not arranged by a loving father with a clear destination in mind. It was self-administered, conducted in the private interior of a brilliance that had nowhere adequate to go, and its lessons accumulated not toward wisdom, but toward a kind of fluency in damage, a deepening expertise in the precise application of harm to the people and situations that mattered most to the one person he had never been able to stop caring about, no matter how thoroughly caring had been complicated by everything else he felt. It is worth pausing here, before the betrayals and the schemes and the long catalogue of destruction that Loki's name eventually came to signify in the minds of everyone who had suffered because of him, to stay with the question of what he actually was before the resentment had fully hardened into something that looked like purpose. He was, to begin with, genuinely extraordinary. The magical arts of Asgard, which occupied a respected but secondary position in a civilization that primarily celebrated martial excellence, responded to Loki with an immediacy and a depth that suggested something more than learned skill, something closer to natural affinity, the way certain instruments seem to choose their players rather than the other way around. He could reshape appearances and deceive perceptions and move through spaces that should have been closed to him with an ease that his teachers found remarkable and that his peers found, depending on their temperament, either fascinating or unsettling. He was also, beneath the facility with deception that his gifts encouraged, a genuinely acute observer of other people, someone who understood motivation and vulnerability and the hidden architecture of desire in ways that most beings never develop because most beings never need to. And this understanding, which might in different circumstances have made him a remarkable counselor or a gifted diplomat, instead became the primary instrument of his capacity for harm, because harm that is precisely calibrated to what a person most fears or most values is harm of a particularly lasting kind. What turned the brightness of Loki's early nature toward these darker applications was not any single event, but the gradual grinding pressure of a particular kind of knowledge, the knowledge of difference. He had grown up beside Thor in the same halls, under the same sky, shaped by the same stories and the same expectations, and yet the shape of his experience within all of that sameness had been quietly, persistently distinct in ways that the court of Asgard, which was not a cruel place but was also not always a perceptive one, did not fully register or address. He was the clever one, the one with the quick answer and the unexpected solution, the one whose value was acknowledged but whose value was also somehow always being evaluated against a different standard than the one applied to his brother, a standard that seemed to shift whenever he came close to meeting it, that moved just far enough ahead to ensure that whatever he achieved would be received as interesting rather than celebrated as great. The discovery of his true parentage, when it finally came, arrived with the particular devastation of something that explained too much. The Marvel Comics tradition has depicted this revelation at different moments and through different mechanisms across various tellings, but its emotional content remains consistent across all of them. The moment when the thing Loki had always half known without being able to name became fully nameable. When the vague, persistent sense of not quite belonging that had accompanied him through every golden corridor of his childhood was revealed to have a source that was not a perception or a sensitivity but a fact. He was the son of Laufey. He was a frost giant, not merely adopted into an Asgardian family, but born to the enemy, born to the people whose relationship with Asgard was defined by cycles of war and devastation, born with a nature that the civilization he'd grown up in considered fundamentally opposed to everything it valued. Odin's motivations for adopting him, which the All-father had kept private rather than offering as context that might have helped his younger son understand his own place in the family, were in fact more complex and more genuinely loving than anything Loki's worst interpretations of the situation allowed for. There had been real care there, real intention to give this abandoned child a life and an identity that his birth father had denied him, and the secrecy had come not from shame or strategy, but from a father's perhaps misguided belief that what a child does not know cannot hurt him. The damage done by that misguided belief, by the years of growing up in the presence of a difference that was felt but not explained, was significant and real, and no amount of retrospective good intention could undo it. What Loki received from the revelation was not the comfort of context, but the confirmation of his worst fears about himself, the sense that everything he had been told he was had been a construction, that the ground he had been standing on had never been entirely solid, and that the beings who most should have told him the truth had instead maintained a fiction that, however kindly intended, had required him to be deceived about the most fundamental facts of his own existence. He might have survived even this, might have found his way through the devastation of the revelation to something workable on the other side, if the thing he was being asked to survive it alongside had not been the continuous involuntary experience of watching Thor receive everything he himself had been reaching for. This is the cruelty that the story does not minimize, not because Loki's response to it was ever justified in its consequences, but because the pain it was responding to was real, and real pain deserves honest acknowledgement even when what it produces is destructive. Every celebration of Thor, every confirmation of the elder son's worthiness and destined greatness, every moment in which the court of Asgard turned its collective warmth and pride toward the Golden Prince and Loki, stood at the edge of that warmth, receiving its reflection rather than its source, added another layer to something that was building inside him with the slow, inevitable pressure of geological force. His first serious schemes against Thor had the quality, in retrospect, of someone testing the limits of a situation they do not yet fully understand, probing for the point at which the love and the approval they have been denied might finally be made available on different terms, through a different kind of demonstration than the ones they have already tried. They were clever, these early schemes, elaborately constructed and reflecting the full extent of a remarkable intelligence applied to the problem of making his brother fail in ways that would illuminate his own superiority by contrast. But they had, underneath the cleverness, a quality of desperation that the cleverness was designed to conceal, the quality of someone who is still, in the deepest part of themselves, hoping to be seen differently rather than hoping to destroy what they cannot have. The irony of Loki's role in the formation of the Avengers, that extraordinary inadvertent contribution to the strengthening of exactly the heroic community he had been trying to undermine, has a particular flavour that the Marvel Comics tradition has always appreciated. He had been attempting to direct a trap for Thor, manipulating circumstances to bring his brother into conflict with the Hulk, in ways that would damage Thor's reputation and demonstrate his unfitness for the trust placed in him, and instead he had drawn together a group of individuals whose combined capabilities would make them the most significant defensive force the planet had ever seen. The Avengers, that foundational gathering of heroes whose name and mission would echo across decades of Marvel Comics storytelling, existed in large part because Loki's scheme required a wider net than he had intended to cast, and Thor himself, far from being discredited, was founding member of something that would define his heroic legacy on Midgard for generations. The failures accumulated, and each failure added to the hardening process that was slowly transforming the envious, brilliant, desperately unhappy younger prince into something more definitively dangerous, someone for whom the original goal of recognition and belonging had been so thoroughly defeated that it had curdled into something that no longer quite remembered its own origin. The schemes became less about demonstration and more about destruction, less about proving something, and more about ensuring that the thing he could not have was not available to anyone else either. And this shift, gradual and never quite complete, because some part of Loki never entirely released the original desire, was the most important transformation of his long story's early phase. What the comics tradition has been most careful to preserve, even across the periods of Loki's most unambiguous villainy, is the thread of genuine intelligence that runs through everything he does, and the thread of genuine pain that runs alongside the intelligence like its shadow. His understanding of people, including his understanding of Thor, is not the understanding of someone who has stopped caring. It is the understanding of someone who cares too much and has no healthy way to act on that caring, someone whose love has been so thoroughly tangled with envy and resentment, and the specific grief of lifelong comparison, that it cannot be straightforwardly expressed, can only be expressed sideways, through interference and manipulation, and the particular intimacy of someone who knows exactly where another person is most vulnerable because they have spent a lifetime paying the closest possible attention. Frigga, the queen of Asgard and the mother of both princes in every way that mattered, occupies a place in this story that the comics have sometimes underserved and sometimes honoured with the depth it deserves. Her love for Loki was genuine and uncomplicated in its source, even when it was complicated in its expression by the difficulty of loving someone whose pain kept producing actions that hurt the people she also loved. She saw him with a clarity that Odin, for all his wisdom, sometimes lacked, saw past the schemes and the bitterness to the brilliant wounded person underneath them, and her consistent willingness to hold space for that person, to refuse to reduce him to the sum of his worst choices, is one of the more quietly heroic acts in the entire Thor mythology. She could not fix what was broken in him. No one could ultimately except Loki himself, and the path to whatever healing was eventually available to him would be long and indirect and interrupted by failures and reversals that would make even the most patient observer doubt it was really happening. But she continued to love him, and her love was not without effect, even when its effects were invisible in the noise of his latest catastrophe. The relationship between Thor and Loki during the middle period of their long conflict had a quality that distinguished it from simpler hero and villain dynamics in ways that the best Thor comics have always insisted upon maintaining. Thor never entirely stopped loving his brother, and this was not naivety or a failure to take the threat seriously, but rather an accurate reading of a situation more complex than the threat alone. He had grown up with Loki. He knew the person inside the schemes the way you know someone you have shared years with, knew the precise cadence of his humour and the specific texture of his brilliance, and the particular way he held himself when something had genuinely gotten through the constructed defences, and none of that knowledge disappeared when the relationship became adversarial. It simply became more painful, because knowledge of a person makes every harmful thing they do more specifically hurtful, more precisely aimed at the understanding you have built of them, more difficult to absorb without feeling something that is not just anger but grief. Loki, for his part, was never quite able to commit entirely to the version of the story in which Thor was simply his enemy. He told that story, performed it with considerable skill and conviction across many encounters, retreated into it when the alternative felt too exposed or too hopeless, or too far beyond what he could currently manage to reach for. But it was a performance over a reality that remained more complicated, and the moments when the performance slipped, the moments visible across decades of comic storytelling in which something genuine moved across Loki's face when Thor was in danger, or when Thor addressed him with the specific warmth of someone who has not yet given up, were among the most emotionally significant moments in the entire mythology, brief illuminations of the person the story had been about from the beginning, the brilliant abandoned child who had grown up wanting nothing more complicated than to belong and had never quite found the way. The magic that Loki practiced, and the ends to which he directed it, evolved across the years of his conflict with Thor in ways that reflected both his growing power and his deepening isolation. He became, over time, one of the most genuinely formidable magical practitioners in all 9 realms. His early facility with illusion and shape-shifting developing into mastery of disciplines that most Asgardian sorcerers would not have attempted, and the breadth and depth of his magical knowledge gave him capabilities that made him a threat of a different category than the purely physical villains Thor also faced. He could not simply be overpowered. He had to be outthought, and outthinking Loki, whose intelligence had been honed across centuries of adversarial observation of the person who knew him best, was among the more demanding challenges that the Thor mythology had to offer. And yet the story was never only a story about conflict. Beneath every scheme and every betrayal, and every moment of deliberate, precisely calibrated harm, it remained a story about 2 brothers who had grown up in the same light and had been differently shaped by it, and whose relationship to each other, however damaged, however burdened with history and grievance and the accumulated weight of everything they had done to each other, retained a thread of connection that neither of them had ever managed to cut completely. That thread would be pulled taut many times in the years to come, would be tested by circumstances that seemed designed specifically to determine whether it could be broken, and what the story would slowly and painfully reveal, across arcs and decades and multiple cycles of destruction and partial repair, was that it could not quite be broken, and that this indestructibility was not a weakness in the story but its deepest truth, the thing that made all the rest of it worth telling. Not every part of Thor's story lives in the territory of exile and rivalry, and the long, painful education of a god learning what he does not yet know. There is another country in the Thor mythology, warmer and less fraught, whose landscape is defined not by the pressure of destiny or the weight of family complication, but by the simpler and more immediately sustaining pleasures of genuine companionship, of people who have chosen each other freely, and who find in that choosing a quality of belonging that birthright alone can never quite provide. This is the country of the Warriors 3 and the Lady Sif, and it runs through the entire Thor saga like a river that does not always appear on the surface of the story, but that feeds everything that grows alongside it, keeping the larger narrative green and alive even during its longest dry seasons. Fandral the Dashing, as the Marvel Comics tradition established him in the foundational Kirby and Lee era, and as subsequent creators have continued to develop him, is the member of the group most immediately legible to anyone who has ever encountered the archetype he embodies, the golden-haired, quick-smiling adventurer for whom the world is primarily a source of pleasure and whose relationship to danger is characterized by an enthusiasm that looks, from the outside, indistinguishable from the absence of fear, but is, on closer examination, something more interesting than that. Fandral is not fearless. He is someone who has decided, through long experience and genuine reflection, that fear is a less interesting response to the world than delight, and who applies that decision with remarkable consistency across circumstances that would test the resolution of most beings considerably more than they test his. His sword work is exceptional, his manner with people unfailingly warm, and his capacity for finding the comic dimension of even the most serious situation has saved more than one tense confrontation from escalating beyond the point of recovery, because laughter, introduced at the right moment, can deflate a tension that force would only compound. Hogun the Grim occupies the opposite end of the Warriors 3's emotional spectrum with a thoroughness that suggests the group was assembled by someone with an instinct for the kind of balance that makes long companionship sustainable. Where Fandral moves through the world with constant brightness, Hogun moves through it with a gravity that is neither unhappiness nor pessimism, but something closer to the quality of attention paid by someone who takes things seriously, because he has learned, through experience rather than through temperament, that serious things deserve serious attention. He is the member of the group least given to speech, most given to observation, and his silences carry the particular weight of a being whose stillness is chosen rather than imposed, someone who speaks when he has something to say rather than to fill the air with the sound of his own voice. His fighting style reflects his character, economical and precise and entirely without showmanship. Oriented entirely toward effectiveness and entirely indifferent to how that effectiveness appears to observers, he is, in the vocabulary that those who have fought alongside him use among themselves, exactly the person you want beside you when things have gone as badly as they can go, because his presence does not waver, and his judgment does not cloud, and his commitment to the people he has chosen does not diminish under pressure, but seems, if anything, to intensify. And then there is Volstagg, magnificent Volstagg, whose physical scale is matched only by his appetite, and whose appetite, it becomes clear over the course of his long presence in the Thor mythology, extends well beyond the considerable quantities of food and drink he is celebrated for consuming, to encompass an equally considerable appetite for life in its fullest and most generous expression. He is enormous and boisterous, and given to stories about his own heroic exploits that grow in the telling with a cheerful disregard for strict factual accuracy, and the Warriors Three would not be what they are without him, because his particular quality of exuberant, unself-conscious joy in existing provides a kind of emotional weather that the group needs, a persistent warmth that makes the harder things easier to carry, and the dangerous things easier to face without the weight of them becoming oppressive. He is also, beneath the performance of magnificent self-regard that is one of his great pleasures, genuinely brave and genuinely loyal, someone whose apparent frivolity conceals a character capable of real sacrifice when sacrifice is what the moment requires. And the gap between how he presents himself and what he actually is when it matters represents one of the Thor mythology's more quietly endearing ongoing jokes. The Lady Sif stands apart from the Warriors Three in category if not in closeness, a warrior of extraordinary skill whose presence in Thor's story carries a different kind of emotional weight than the comfortable warmth of the male companions. She is dark-haired and fierce and possessed of a technical mastery of combat that has been won through a dedication to the craft that even the most gifted natural warriors respect. Because Sif's excellence is the excellence of someone who decided what they wanted to be, and then became it with a completeness that does not leave room for the ordinary doubts and hesitations that accompany most ambitious undertakings. She chose the warrior's path in a context that did not always make that path straightforwardly available to her, and she chose it not as rebellion or statement, but as the simple expression of what she knew herself to be, and the clarity of that self-knowledge gives her a kind of authority in every room she enters that has nothing to do with volume or assertion, and everything to do with the quality of presence that comes from being entirely, unambiguously yourself. Her relationship with Thor is one of the oldest and most layered in the entire mythology, carrying within it the full history of people who have known each other across very long spans of time, and who have been many different things to each other across that span. They were companions in childhood, training partners in youth, something closer to love in the middle period of their long acquaintance, and then, as Thor's mortal entanglements and the general complexity of his life began to create distances that even the most durable connection struggles to bridge entirely, something that retained the warmth and trust of all its previous forms while becoming something harder to name precisely, the relationship of two people who know each other with the deep, unguarded knowledge that only time and shared danger can produce, and who care about each other with a constancy that does not depend on being the primary focus of each other's lives. Sif has never needed Thor to define her, and this is part of what has always made their connection genuinely equal rather than simply affectionate, because genuine equality between people requires that each of them be capable of existing fully without the other, and Sif has always been, in every dimension of her remarkable life, entirely capable of that. The adventures that Thor and his companions undertook together across the 9 realms, those episodic journeys that make up a significant and underappreciated portion of the Thor mythology's emotional texture, had a quality that was distinct from the larger, destiny-weighted arcs of Thor's individual story. They were smaller in scale and larger in pleasure, driven less by the pressure of cosmic necessity, and more by the particular satisfactions of moving through the world with people you trust completely, and who trust you in return, meeting whatever the world presents with the combined resources of a group that is more capable together than the sum of its individual capabilities would suggest. These journeys took them through Asgard's neighbouring realms, through territories of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary danger, through encounters with beings and civilizations whose existence expanded the imaginative scope of the Marvel cosmos in ways that the street-level heroism of Midgard could not provide. The journey through Nidavellir, the realm of the dwarven craftsman whose skills had produced Mjolnir itself, had the quality of a pilgrimage undertaken partly out of professional respect and partly out of genuine curiosity about a civilization whose values were almost entirely different from Asgard's own. The dwarves were not warriors in the Asgardian sense, and not scholars in the sense of beings who valued knowledge for its own contemplative pleasures, but craftsmen in the deepest possible meaning of that word, beings for whom the creation of excellent things was the primary expression of everything worth expressing, and the relationship between what they made and what it meant had a seriousness and a precision that Thor found genuinely moving in the way that unexpected encounters with excellence always moved him. Volstagg ate an implausible quantity of dwarven food and declared it adequate. Fandral charmed every dwarven artisan he met somehow, through a combination of genuine appreciation and irresistible manner. Hogun said very little and noticed everything. Sif examined the weaponry with the careful attention of someone who had devoted her life to understanding what a well-made instrument could do in capable hands, and Thor stood in the forges where Mjolnir had been made and felt, in the ambient heat and the ring of metal and the smell of uru ore being worked to its tolerance, something that was not quite memory but was adjacent to it, the particular resonance of being in the presence of the thing that made you what you are. The passage through Vanaheim brought them into contact with the elder civilization of the Vanir, beings whose relationship with the Aesir gods of Asgard was ancient and complicated, and defined by a war so long ago that its details had become more mythological than historical, even by Asgardian standards. The Vanir were, in the Marvel cosmology, figures of considerable power and considerable dignity, and their reception of Thor's company was formal in the way that encounters between peoples with long, complicated histories tend to be formal, warm enough to be genuine but measured enough to acknowledge that warmth between old adversaries is a cultivated thing rather than a natural one. Fandral navigated the formality with his usual facility, and Hogun watched the Vanir with the particular attention he gave to beings he was still assessing, and Thor conducted himself with the diplomatic thoughtfulness that the exile and the years on Midgard had been slowly developing in him, and the visit concluded with something that felt, if not like friendship, then like the genuine possibility of it, which was perhaps the best outcome available. There were harder journeys too, passages through Niflheim that brought them close to the edges of Hela's domain, and required the particular combination of courage and care that proximity to death's border always demands, expeditions into territories occupied by beings whose intentions were genuinely hostile, and whose capabilities were genuinely formidable, encounters that tested every member of the group, and produced the specific quality of trust that only shared danger can generate. It is one of the more reliable truths about companionship that the people you have been afraid with become important to you in ways that the people you have only been happy with do not quite match, because fear shared becomes courage shared, and courage shared becomes the foundation of something that does not easily break. What these journeys produced in Thor, alongside the practical benefits of experience, and the expansion of his understanding of the 9 realms, was something that is perhaps more difficult to quantify, but no less real for that difficulty. They produced in him a settled sense of being known, the specific comfort that comes from moving through the world in the company of people who have seen you at your best and at your worst, and who remain in full knowledge of both, entirely committed to your continued company. The Warriors 3 knew Thor's tendencies and his blind spots, and his capacity for the particular kind of impulsive action that had once sent him charging into Jotunheim without his father's permission, and they remained beside him not despite this knowledge, but in some sense because of it, because knowing someone fully and choosing to stay is the purest form of the choice that fellowship represents. Sif knew him even more completely than the Warriors 3, and her knowledge had the additional dimension of the romantic history between them, the years when what they had been to each other was something more specifically intimate than companionship, and the transition from that intimacy to the form their relationship eventually settled into was handled, in the Thor mythology, with a care and an honesty that honoured both what it had been and what it became. She did not become less important to him when they became something other than romantic partners, and he did not become less important to her, because the love between them had always been more than any single form could contain, and survived the changing of forms intact, expressed differently, but not diminished. The culture of Asgardian warrior society, as it is visible through the daily life of this fellowship, had qualities worth pausing to appreciate before the larger story moves on to its heavier chapters. It was a culture that took loyalty seriously in a way that went beyond social expectation into something closer to spiritual commitment, that understood the choice to stand beside someone in difficulty as one of the most significant choices a being could make, and that celebrated those who made it with the same honour it granted to those who achieved remarkable things in battle. The feasting hall traditions that the comics depicted across many stories, those long evenings of shared food and shared story, and the particular warmth of a fire surrounded by people who have been through things together, represented one of the more genuinely appealing aspects of the Asgardian civilization that shaped Thor, a reminder that even a culture built around the awareness of its own eventual destruction can find ways to be genuinely, sustainably joyful in the present. Thor in the company of these people was a different version of himself than the one visible in his solo confrontations with destiny, and his complicated negotiations with his father, and his ongoing, unresolved relationship with his brother. He was looser, funnier, more willing to be the subject of the group's affectionate mockery rather than always its leader and its primary concern. Volstag's stories about his own heroism were always subtly more heroic than the version Thor remembered, and pointing this out was one of the group's reliable pleasures. Fandrel's constant, unreformable charm was a source of comedy that never quite exhausted itself. Hogun's silences, when they broke, produced observations so precisely accurate that they had a quality almost of revelation, and the laughter they generated was the laughter of recognition rather than simple humour. These people were his in a way that was different from the way Asgard was his, or Midgard was his, or even his family was his, because the claim they had on him was not of obligation or inheritance, or the weight of shared blood and history, but of pure, freely chosen, continuously renewed affection, and the claim he had on them was of the same kind. In a life as long and as complicated and as frequently weighed down by the pressure of destiny as Thor's, this quality of freely chosen fellowship was not a small thing. It was, in some of the story's most honest moments, one of the primary reasons that the weight of everything else was bearable, the proof that even in a mythology defined by the awareness of inevitable loss, the things that matter can be genuinely, sustainably, warmly present, available not at the grand scale of cosmic significance, but at the immediate scale of a fire and a table, and the voices of people who know you completely and are glad you are there. There is a question that runs underneath the entire Thor mythology, like a current beneath a river's visible surface, shaping the direction of everything above it without always being directly seen. It is not a question about strength, though strength is everywhere in these stories, and it is not a question about courage, though courage is tested repeatedly and in every possible register. It is a simpler question than either of those and a harder one, and it is this: what does it actually mean to be worthy, and how does a being come to know whether they are? The enchantment that Odin placed upon Mjolnir, those words embedded in the hammer's surface that declared the condition of its use, was not primarily a security measure, not simply a way of ensuring that the weapon did not fall into the wrong hands, though it served that function as well. It was, in its deepest intention, a philosophical instrument, a way of making the abstract question of readiness and moral fitness into something concrete and testable, something that could give an answer in real time rather than requiring the long retrospective assessment that is the only other way to discover whether a person has become who they need to be. The hammer said, continuously and without ambiguity, that the question of worthiness was alive and active, that it was not answered once and then settled, but required ongoing demonstration. That the right to carry great power was not a status conferred permanently, but a condition maintained through choices made repeatedly across every circumstance that called for choice. Thor, in his youth, had not understood this. His ability to lift the hammer in those early years was real, genuinely earned in the sense that he possessed qualities that Mjolnir's enchantment recognized as pointing in the right direction: courage and genuine care for others, and a basically generous nature that wanted good things for the people around him. But he had understood the hammer's response to him as a verdict rather than as an ongoing assessment, as a declaration that he was worthy rather than as an observation that he was, in this moment and these circumstances, demonstrating something worth responding to. The difference between those two understandings seems subtle from the outside, but is, in practice, enormous, because someone who believes they have been permanently declared worthy does not need to continue examining their choices with the same care as someone who understands that worthiness is a condition they are either maintaining or failing to maintain in every moment. The exile was the first time the hammer withdrew its recognition, and the shock of that withdrawal, the discovery that what he had taken to be a permanent feature of his identity was actually a conditional one, was the beginning of the education whose later chapters would be written across decades of Marvel Comics storytelling. He had been stripped of his power and his memories along with his worthiness, so the lesson was not immediately available to him in its full implications during the exile itself. But when he returned from the cave in Norway with Mjolnir in his hand again, he returned to the question in a different state than he had left it, carrying inside him the lived experience of being someone without extraordinary power in a world that continued to need things done and people helped, regardless of whether the person available to do the helping was equipped with divine capabilities or simply with two hands and a genuine desire to be useful. The years that followed, the early period of his heroic activities on Midgard and his growing engagement with both the Avengers and the ongoing complications of his Asgardian responsibilities, were years in which the question of worthiness was present but not yet fully articulated, a background hum in the experience of a being who was genuinely trying to live up to what the hammer's enchantment asked of him, without yet having a completely clear understanding of what that was. He fought well. He protected the people who needed protection. He tried, with increasing sincerity and increasing success, to listen before acting, to consider the full scope of a situation before committing to a response, to hold the claims of those who would be affected by his choices with the seriousness they deserved, rather than simply responding to the most immediately compelling demand in any given moment. These were real improvements, genuine developments in the quality of his character, and they were recognized as such by the hammer, which remained available to him throughout this period as a sign that the direction of his development was sound even if the destination had not yet been reached. Walt Simonson's legendary run on the Thor comics beginning in 1983 and running through the middle of the decade represents the period in which the question of worthiness received perhaps its most sustained and most dramatically powerful exploration. Simonson, whose understanding of the Thor mythology was both deep and genuinely creative, brought to the material a willingness to take the philosophical content of the enchantment seriously as a driver of narrative, to construct stories whose plots were in service of the moral question rather than the other way around. The stories he told during this period, including the introduction of Beta Ray Bill, remain among the most significant in the entire history of Thor comics, precisely because they were willing to go to the places that a genuine engagement with the worthiness question required, including places that were uncomfortable and humbling, and that refused the easy consolation of confirming that the protagonist had already arrived where he needed to be. Beta Ray Bill arrived in the Marvel Universe as a challenge not to Thor's physical dominance but to his understanding of what the hammer's choice meant. Bill was a warrior of another people, the Corbinites, whose civilization had been destroyed and whose last survivors he was sworn to protect, and whose own character was marked by exactly the qualities that Mjolnir's enchantment was designed to recognize: genuine courage, complete selflessness, the willingness to sacrifice everything for the protection of those who depended on him. When Bill lifted Mjolnir in the first encounter between the two warriors, the hammer responded to him as it had always responded to Thor, which is to say it responded to what he actually was rather than to what he was supposed to be, according to any prior arrangement, and the reality of that response required everyone in the story, including Thor himself, to confront what it actually meant. It meant that worthiness was not species-specific, and not Asgardian-specific, and not even Thor-specific. It meant that the enchantment was genuinely principled rather than merely loyal, that it was measuring something real rather than performing a preference, and that the something real it was measuring was available in principle to any being whose character had developed to the point where the qualities it required were genuinely present. Thor's response to this discovery was the most important thing about it, because the response available to someone who has just learned that what they thought was uniquely theirs is actually an expression of a universal standard, covers a very wide range, from genuine humility and appreciation for the standard to wounded pride, and an attempt to reassert primacy through other means. Thor, whose journey had been preparing him for exactly this kind of test, responded with the former, and his response was not immediate or easy, or without the particular internal friction that accompanies any significant recalibration of self-understanding. But it was genuine, and it was ultimately complete, and what emerged from the encounter with Beta Ray Bill was a Thor who understood the hammer's enchantment more accurately than he had before, who recognized that his relationship with Mjolnir was not a declaration of permanent, exclusive worthiness, but an ongoing recognition of a character in development. A character that needed to continue developing if the recognition was to continue. Odin's the satisfaction of finding that what you valued most is more real and more widely available than you had understood. J. Michael Straczynski's work on the Thor comics in the early 2000s brought the worthiness question into a different register, exploring it not through the drama of combat and cosmic encounter, but through the quieter, more psychologically intimate territory of self-examination and the particular kind of courage required to look honestly at one's own history and accept what one finds there. Straczynski's Thor was a being engaged in the slow, painstaking work of understanding what he had done across centuries of choices and what those choices said about who he actually was, as distinct from who he had always assumed himself to be, and the process was neither comfortable nor quick, but had the particular quality of realness that distinguishes genuine self-examination from performance. The specific crisis of worthiness that Straczynski's run explored most fully was connected to Thor's growing awareness of what his trust in Odin and his participation in Asgardian politics had sometimes made him complicit in, the ways in which his unexamined loyalty to the civilization that raised him had occasionally led him to act in the service of its interests at the expense of the interests of those it treated as less important. The Asgardian civilization, for all its genuine nobility and genuine excellence, was not without its failures and its moral blind spots, and a warrior who had spent centuries serving its interests without always examining them critically had participated in some of those failures whether he had understood what he was doing or not. The recognition of this was not the destruction of his sense of himself or of his love for Asgard. It was the deepening of both, the movement from the love of someone who accepts without examination to the love of someone who sees clearly and chooses anyway, which is a more demanding love and also a more honest and more sustainable one. The question of what makes a person worthy, as the Thor mythology has explored it across all of these different creative visions and narrative approaches, does not resolve into a simple checklist or a permanent achievement. It remains a question, actively and continuously alive, and its aliveness is not a failure of the mythology to provide an answer, but its deepest wisdom about the nature of moral development. Worthy beings are not beings who have finished becoming who they need to be. They are beings who have committed seriously and with full awareness of the ongoing nature of the commitment to the continuous work of examining their choices and their motivations and their relationship to the power they carry, and who bring to that work not the grim determination of someone performing a duty, but something closer to the attitude that Thor's own character at its best exemplified, the genuine, wholehearted desire to be the kind of person who deserves the trust that others place in them. The hammer does not ask for perfection. The comic book stories that have explored the enchantment most honestly have always been clear about this, showing Thor failing and recovering, showing him making choices he later regrets, and finding the path back from those choices, showing the standard as something that forgives sincere effort and genuine course correction, even while it cannot overlook the abandonment of effort or the refusal to correct. What the hammer asks for is, in this sense, exactly what Odin must have hoped his son would eventually understand that it asked for, not the static declaration that you have arrived, but the dynamic, continuous, openly vulnerable commitment to the ongoing journey of becoming someone who carries great power with the lightness and the care and the genuine humility that great power, properly understood, requires. There is something deeply restful about this understanding, once it has been arrived at, because it replaces the anxious vigilance of someone protecting a status with the settled engagement of someone participating in a process they have genuinely accepted. The younger Thor who needed his worthiness confirmed was always, at some level, afraid that the confirmation might be withdrawn, and that fear made him hold himself stiffly against the possibility, made him defensive and sometimes arrogant in ways that were the opposite of the quality the hammer was asking for. The older Thor, the one shaped by exile and loss and the long, humbling education of centuries spent learning to see himself clearly, carried the hammer with something that looked, from the outside, like ease, and was, from the inside, the specific ease of someone who has stopped fighting the question and learned to live inside it with curiosity and openness, and the particular peace that comes from no longer needing the answer to be anything other than what it honestly is. The question of worthiness, as the Thor mythology explores it across its long unfolding, carries within it a quieter and more unsettling question that the hammer's enchantment does not answer directly, but that the larger story has always been circling, arriving at from different angles across different eras of telling. If a being can become worthy through the patient work of self-examination and genuine development, can a civilization do the same? Can the institutions and traditions and accumulated choices of an entire people be subjected to the same honest assessment that the hammer demands of individuals? And if they can, what happens when that assessment reveals not merely imperfection, which all civilizations contain, but something more structural, a pattern of choices so deeply embedded in the way things have always been done that changing it would require not reform but something closer to ending and beginning again? Ragnarok is the Norse answer to this question, and it is an answer of extraordinary severity and extraordinary courage. The twilight of the gods, the prophesied destruction of Asgard and everything it contains, was not imagined by the people who first told these stories as a punishment or a failure or a tragedy in the ordinary sense, though it contains all of those elements. It was imagined as something more structurally fundamental than any of those things, as the necessary conclusion of a story that has run its full length, the completion of a cycle whose ending was written into its beginning, the way night is written into the structure of a day, or silence into the structure of sound. The Asgardians knew Ragnarok was coming. They had always known. The Norns had told them, the seers had confirmed it, the prophecies had been preserved across generations with a specificity that left no room for comfortable ambiguity. And they had continued anyway, had built and loved and fought and celebrated and grieved with the full knowledge that all of it would end, because the knowledge of ending had never seemed to them like a reason to stop living excellently in the present. The Marvel Comics tradition inherited this mythology and made it its own across decades of storytelling, engaging with the concept of Ragnarok in ways that range from individual story arcs, invoking the imagery and emotional weight of the Norse original, to the full-scale civilization-ending event that J. Michael Straczynski and Olivier Coipel brought to the Thor comics in the early 2000s, with a seriousness and a grandeur that honoured both the source material and the decades of Marvel storytelling that had made Asgard feel like a real place worth mourning. The Ragnarok of the Straczynski era was not simply a cataclysm imposed from outside. It was, at its deepest level, the culmination of choices made across centuries, the arrival of consequences that had been accumulating since long before any of the characters currently present had been born, and Thor's role in it was not merely to survive, or to prevent it, but to understand it, and then to make the most difficult choice the mythology had ever asked of him. Surtur, the fire demon of Muspelheim, whose existence in the Nine Realms cosmology represents the principle of consuming destruction, the force that unmakes rather than creates, has been the primary agent of Ragnarok's prophesied arrival across most of the Marvel Comics tellings of the event. He is not a villain in the ordinary sense of someone who wants something that can be taken away, or whose plan can be defeated by sufficiently determined heroic opposition. He is something more fundamental than that, more like a natural force that has taken a form convenient for storytelling, the heat-death of a universe rendered personal and purposeful, and engaging with him requires a different kind of thinking than engaging with Loki's schemes, or even the combined hostility of the Nine Realms' worst actors. You cannot simply defeat Surtur. You can delay him, can buy time through extraordinary effort, but the fire he carries is the fire that was always going to consume the World Tree eventually, and the stories that have dealt most honestly with him have dealt honestly with this, have refused the consolation of a clean heroic victory, and insisted instead on the more demanding question of what you do when the thing you love is going to be lost regardless of how hard you fight. The cycles of Ragnarok that appear across the Thor mythology before the Straczynski era established a pattern that those later stories would eventually name and examine directly. Asgard would be threatened, the heroes would fight, the destruction would be narrowly averted or partially absorbed, and the world would be rebuilt, beginning the cycle again from a position that resembled but was not identical to where it had started. This pattern had a quality that was partly reassuring, the confirmation that Asgard was resilient, that its people could survive what threatened to destroy them, and partly troubling, because cycles that repeat without resolution are not the same as continuity, and the difference between a civilization that is genuinely ongoing and one that is merely recurring is a difference with significant moral implications. What Straczynski's Ragnarok introduced into this pattern was the understanding that the cycle was not natural but constructed, that the deaths and rebirths of Asgard had been orchestrated by forces whose interest in perpetuating the cycle was not benevolent but exploitative, that the gods and their civilization had been dying and returning not as part of a genuine cosmic order, but as players in a story that someone else was telling for their own purposes. The beings the comics called those who sit above in shadow, entities who fed on the narrative energy of the Asgardian tragedy, and who had arranged the conditions of the cycle to ensure its perpetuation, represented something that Thor's growing capacity for clear-eyed self-examination was eventually able to perceive and name. The discovery that what had been accepted as fate was actually a trap, and that the choice to continue accepting it was not noble endurance but something closer to complicity. This discovery placed Thor at the centre of a moral question of the highest possible order. If the cycle of Ragnarok was not fate but a trap, then ending it required not the heroic resistance of fighting what was prophesied, but something far more demanding: the willingness to allow the destruction to proceed, to refuse to rebuild, to accept the actual ending of everything he loved rather than permit the continuation of a cycle whose repetition served purposes he could not endorse. The courage required for this choice was categorically different from the courage required to face Surtur in battle, or to stand firm against the combined armies of the Nine Realms. Battle courage asks you to risk your own destruction. The courage Thor was being asked to demonstrate required him to choose the destruction of everyone and everything he cared about, voluntarily and with full understanding, because the alternative was a continuation that had been revealed as something other than the genuine life he had believed he was protecting. The process by which Thor arrived at this choice was neither quick nor comfortable, and the Straczynski comics honoured that process by refusing to rush it. The discovery of the cycle's constructed nature was itself a long unwinding, a series of revelations, each of which expanded the scope of what needed to be understood before any choice could be made with full knowledge of what it was choosing. Thor consulted the Norns, whose relationship to the cycle was more complex than it appeared, whose apparent role as neutral observers of fate turned out to be entangled with the interests of the entities perpetuating it. He sought the counsel of Odin, whose own knowledge of the cycle's true nature raised further questions about what the All-Father had known, and when he had known it, and what his choices in response to that knowledge said about the nature of the love he had always claimed for his son and his people. He sat with the full weight of what had been revealed and allowed himself to feel it without immediately resolving it into action, which was itself an expression of the maturity that decades of hard education had been building in him, the capacity to remain present with difficulty rather than moving immediately to the comfort of decision. The warriors and the people of Asgard, as the final Ragnarok approached, faced their ending with the quality that the entire mythology had been building toward, the specific Asgardian dignity of people who have always known this was coming, and who have always insisted in the face of that knowledge on living as fully and as excellently as possible, right up to the moment when the living stops. The warriors three fought with everything they had. Sif stood and did not retreat. The ordinary people of Asgard, the craftsmen and the scholars and the healers and the farmers, whose daily lives had always formed the background against which the heroic stories played out, met what was coming with a steadiness that was neither resignation nor despair, but something harder to name. The particular quality of a people who have understood at the deepest level that how you face the end is as important as anything you did before it. Surtur's fire, when it finally moved without the containment of heroic opposition to slow it, had the quality that all-consuming things have in the moments when they are finally allowed their full scope. Not violent exactly, not the chaotic destructiveness of something out of control, but the terrible impersonal thoroughness of something that is simply doing what it has always been destined to do in the moment when nothing is in its way. The golden towers came down, the bridges dissolved, the eternal sky of Asgard, which had never been dark in the way that other skies are dark, became something other than what it had been, and the transformation was complete in the way that only endings are complete, leaving nothing unfinished, nothing left over, the whole vast, beautiful, complicated civilizational structure reduced to the quality of memory. Thor, at the centre of this ending, experienced it not as defeat but as the completion of a choice he had made with full understanding of its consequences, and this distinction made all the difference in the emotional register of what was happening. He had not lost. He had chosen. The difference between those two experiences is the difference between being swept away by a tide you could not stop and stepping into the water of your own volition because you understood that stepping in was what the situation required, and the second of those experiences, however much it costs, preserves the quality of agency that is the one thing no external force can take from a person who refuses to surrender it. What remained after the fire was not nothing, though it took time to understand that. The souls of the Asgardians, the essential qualities that had made them who they were, did not dissolve in Surtur's fire the way the buildings and the bridges had dissolved. They persisted in the way that important things sometimes persist beyond the forms that contained them, scattered and quiet and waiting, not for rescue exactly, but for the conditions that would allow them to remember what they had been, and to begin the work of becoming it again in a new form and a new context. The ending of Asgard was real, it was complete, and it was also, because this is what genuine endings sometimes turn out to be, the precondition for something that could not have begun while the old structure was still standing, something that would take the best of what Asgard had always been and free it from the parts of the cycle that had kept it trapped in a story that was not its own. The silence that followed the ending had a quality that those who have experienced the aftermath of genuine, irreversible change will recognize. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of potential. The particular stillness of a space that has been cleared and that is waiting, without urgency and without agenda to discover what will grow in it. Thor carried that silence with him into the long period that followed, into the absence from the world that his choice had required, and he sat with it the way he had learned, through all the years of his long education, to sit with difficult things, with patience and with openness, and with the trust that was not certainty, but was its own kind of strength. The trust that what had ended was not all there was, that the world tree still stood somewhere beneath the ash, that the thread connecting all the realms was not severed, but only, for now, still. Silence, when it follows something as total as the ending of a civilization, has a texture that is different from ordinary quiet. It is not simply the absence of sound or activity, but the presence of everything that was, and is no longer, a density of absence that a person moving through it can feel against their skin the way they might feel the change in air pressure before a storm. Thor carried this silence with him through the period that followed Ragnarok's completion, and the carrying of it was itself a kind of work, requiring the same sustained engagement that any serious thing requires, the willingness to remain present with what is, rather than retreating into the comfort of imagining what might have been, or rushing forward into the consolation of what might yet be. He had chosen the ending. He had understood what he was choosing. And the understanding did not make the aftermath light. The absence from the world that followed was not precisely death, and not precisely sleep, and not the kind of divine withdrawal that sometimes appears in mythologies as a god retreating to a higher realm to contemplate matters beyond mortal comprehension. It was something more specific and more personal than any of those, the necessary pause of a being who has expended everything in the completion of something enormous and who must wait. In whatever form waiting takes for someone between the ending of one existence and the beginning of another, for the conditions that will make continuation possible. The Marvel Comics tradition handled this period with a restraint that honoured its weight, allowing the absence to be genuinely felt rather than rushing past it toward the recovery that readers knew was coming, because the recovery only means what it needs to mean if the loss it follows has been given its full measure of reality. What brought Thor back to the world, when the conditions for return had finally assembled themselves in the way that necessary things eventually do, was not a grand cosmic event, or the intervention of some higher power with a plan for his restoration. It was something considerably quieter and more personal, the kind of return that happens not because the universe has decided it is time, but because the being in question has completed whatever interior process the absence was for and is ready. In some deep and not entirely articulable sense, to begin again. J. Michael Straczynski's Thor Volume 3, which began publication in 2007, and which represented one of the most anticipated returns of a character in modern Marvel Comics history, opened not with thunder or spectacle, but with the image of Donald Blake, sitting somewhere ordinary, aware that something was waiting to be found, aware in the particular way of someone who does not yet have the words for what they know, but whose body has already understood it. The return to the Donald Blake identity was not a repetition of the original exile, not a second iteration of the same lesson, delivered to a student who had failed to learn it the first time. It was something structurally similar but emotionally different, the voluntary reassumption of a mortal form by a being who now understood what that form meant, and who chose it not because he had been sent to it, but because the continuity it represented, the thread connecting the god who had allowed Asgard to end with the physician who had learned to be useful without being powerful, was the most honest way back into existence that was available to him. He walked out of whatever space the absence had occupied and into a world that had continued without him, in the way that worlds do, full of the accumulated changes of the years that had passed, and entirely indifferent to the cosmic significance of what had just returned to it. Broxton, Oklahoma was not a place that had been expecting to become significant. It was a small town on the flat, wide-skied plains of the American Midwest, the kind of place whose residents lived at the particular pace of communities that have not been touched by the concentrated urgency of large cities, where the distance between neighbours is measured in acres rather than feet, and where the sky, uncrowded by tall buildings or competing light sources, is visible in its full enormous extent from horizon to horizon. It had a diner and a gas station and a hardware store, and the kind of modest functional architecture that reflects a community's practical relationship with the land it occupies, rather than any ambition to impress visitors, and it had, in the ordinary course of its ordinary existence, no particular reason to be the location at which the kingdom of Asgard chose to re-establish itself above the plains. But that is what happened, and the image of it, Asgard floating in the Oklahoma sky above the flat farmland, its golden towers catching the prairie light in the early mornings and casting their glow across the fields in the evenings, is one of the most quietly extraordinary images in the entire history of Thor comics, the kind of juxtaposition that achieves its effect not through spectacle alone, but through the specific emotional resonance of the very ancient and the very ordinary placed in immediate, unavoidable proximity to each other. The farmers driving their trucks along the county roads beneath the floating realm of gods, the diner customers watching through the windows as something beyond the scope of their previous experience became simply the new feature of their local landscape. The children who grew up afterward with Asgard as a fact of their world, the way children in other places grow up with mountains or rivers as facts of theirs, these details carried a kind of meaning that the grander aspects of the Thor mythology sometimes struggled to achieve, the meaning of the mythological made genuinely, physically present in the daily life of ordinary people. Thor's first act upon his proper return, once the Donald Blake form had served its purpose of transition, and he had emerged in his full identity with Mjolnir in hand, and the full weight of everything he was and everything he carried restored to him, was not to seek out enemies or to reassert his presence among the heroes of Midgard, or to make any of the large public gestures that a returning god might have been expected to make. It was to find the lost Asgardians. This was the work that the return required before anything else could properly begin. The recovery of the souls that had survived Ragnarok's fire scattered among the human population of Midgard, living inside human bodies and human lives without access to their own memories and identities, unaware of what they were beneath the forms they currently occupied. The process of finding them had a quality that was unlike any other kind of quest in the Thor mythology, because it was not a quest against opposition but a quest toward recognition, not the discovery of something hidden by an enemy, but the recovery of something that had been waiting without knowing it was waiting, preserved in a form that could not yet understand its own preservation. The Asgardians who had survived in human hosts were not imprisoned or suffering, were not aware of any loss because the memories of what had been lost were not accessible to the consciousness currently occupying their lives. They were simply people, living human lives with human concerns and human relationships, and Thor's arrival in those lives with the knowledge of what lay beneath the surface of their current existence was an intrusion, however gentle and however well-intentioned, into identities that had become real in their own right during the time they had been the only available version of themselves. The reunions were not uniformly joyful, and the Straczynski comics were honest about this in ways that added considerable depth to what could have been a straightforward series of triumphant recoveries. Some of the Asgardians, upon having their true natures revealed to them, experienced the return of their divine identities as a liberation, a restoration of themselves to a fullness they had been missing without knowing what the fullness consisted of. Others experienced it as a complication, an unwelcome intrusion of a larger identity into a smaller but genuinely inhabited life that had developed its own attachments and its own meaning during the period of their human existence. The human relationships they had formed, the jobs they had taken, the communities they had become part of, these were not nothing simply because they had been formed in the context of an incomplete identity, and the question of what those relationships meant now that the full identity had been restored was one that the comics engaged with honestly rather than dismissing as a minor inconvenience in the larger project of Asgardian restoration. Volstag's return carried its own particular quality of comedy and warmth, the large, exuberant Asgardian discovering himself in a human form that had been living a life in some ways well suited to his essential nature, surrounded by children and food and the ordinary domestic pleasures that had always been, beneath his warrior's persona, among the things he valued most. Sif's return was more fraught, her divine identity having been placed in a human host whose own life and history were complicated in ways that created a more difficult negotiation between what she was recovering and what she was, in some sense, taking back from a person who had not asked to be used as a vessel. The Warriors Three came back to themselves through encounters with their full natures that reflected their individual characters. Fandral with something approaching delight, Hogun with the steady, unsurprised quality of someone who had always, at some level, known something was waiting to be recognized. The Asgard that was rebuilt above the Oklahoma plains was not a replica of the civilization that had been consumed in Surtur's fire. It could not have been, and the attempt to make it one would have defeated the purpose of the ending that Thor had chosen to allow. It was instead a beginning, carrying the essential qualities and values of what Asgard had always been at its best, while being free of the accumulated weight of the cycle that had kept the old civilization trapped in a story not entirely its own. The golden architecture was there, rising from the floating realm with the same soaring beauty that had characterized Asgard since the Kirby era first imagined it. But it rose into a different sky, a prairie sky, and beneath it were the flat fields and the ordinary roads and the modest buildings of a small Oklahoma town whose residents were in the process of discovering that having gods for neighbors was, in practical terms, a situation requiring a good deal of mutual adjustment and goodwill on both sides. The relationship that developed between the returned Asgardians and the people of Broxton was one of the more humanly interesting aspects of the Straczynski run, a study in the particular dynamics of an encounter between two very different kinds of community that have been placed in unavoidable proximity and must find ways to coexist that honour both their differences and their shared interest in getting along. The Asgardians brought to this encounter their characteristic combination of genuine generosity and complete unfamiliarity with the scale and pace of human daily life. The Broxton residents brought to it the particular mixture of curiosity and wariness that characterises ordinary people encountering something well outside the range of their previous experience, along with the practical concerns of a small community suddenly dealing with the economic and logistical realities of having a floating golden realm appear above their town. Thor moved between the two communities with the ease of someone who had spent years on Midgard, and who understood both the divine scale of his Asgardian responsibilities and the human scale of the daily concerns that the Broxton residents were navigating. He paid for things. This detail, which the comics treated with a gentle humour that made it more rather than less affecting, reflected his genuine respect for the economic systems of the world he was living alongside, and his understanding that the claim gods might make on the resources of mortal communities, simply by virtue of being gods, was exactly the kind of claim that his long education in humility had taught him to refuse. He ate at the diner and greeted the hardware store owner by name and made himself, with the same patient, unglamorous effort that Donald Blake had once made himself useful in his medical practice, a genuinely present and genuinely contributing member of the community that had become, without planning to, the location of Asgard's new chapter. The domestic quality of this period in Thor's story, the return from cosmic ending to something recognisably ordinary, carried a kind of emotional relief that the larger narrative had earned through the sustained weight of everything that had preceded it. After the philosophical grandeur of the worthiness question and the civilizational scale of Ragnarok's ending, the image of Thor navigating the social dynamics of a small Oklahoma town had a warmth and a humour that felt not like a reduction of the story's ambitions, but like a fulfilment of them. The demonstration that the god who had chosen to allow his civilization's destruction in service of breaking a cycle of exploitation was also the god who would show up in the morning and pay his bill at the diner and be genuinely practically present in the world he had returned to. Because presence at that scale, the daily, mundane, unspectacular scale, was what the exile had originally been trying to teach him, and what all the long education since had been building toward. The rebuilt Asgard above Broxton was not a paradise, and was not presented as one. It had the quality of a civilization in its early chapters, rather than its settled middle. Uncertain about some things and discovering others, working out the terms of its new existence in a world that was different from the one it had known before, and the uncertainty was not a weakness, but a sign of genuine newness, the honest condition of something that has genuinely begun rather than merely resumed. Thor presided over this beginning not as a king, not yet, but as the being most responsible for having made it possible, most responsible for the choice that had cleared the ground on which it was being built, and he brought to that responsibility the quality that all of his long education had been cultivating, the capacity to be fully present in each day's specific demands, without either retreating into the past or rushing toward a future that could only be reached by moving through the present with care and attention, and the kind of humble, practical love that turns out, in the end, to be the most powerful thing available. And so the thunder quiets, as all thunder eventually does, settling back into the sky from which it came, leaving behind it the particular stillness that only arrives after something large and true has passed through. What we have travelled through tonight is not simply the story of a god or a golden realm or a hammer waiting in stone for someone worthy enough to lift it. It is a story about the slow, patient work of becoming, about the discovery that power without humility is incomplete, and that the greatest strength available to any being is the strength to remain open to being changed by what life asks of them. Thor learned this not in a single moment, but across centuries of loss and return, and the quiet, unglamorous daily practice of showing up with care for the world around him. You carry something of that in you as well, the willingness to keep going, to stay present, to love what is finite and precious, and yours for now. Let the golden light of Asgard find you where you are resting tonight. Let the world tree hold everything in its proper place. Let the hammer rest, the realms be still, the long story pause in one of its quieter passages. You have travelled far enough for one night. Let the thunder carry you gently now into sleep.